Hey guys, and welcome to another episode of Let's Max Warframe. Today we're going to be taking another look at the Mareloks' big brother, and the syndicate mod for it, the Grinlok and Deadly Sequence. The Grinlok was released in update 12.1 as an addition to the Grineer Ken Lab in the dojo, and boasts a pretty decent 120 damage a shot, with the majority, 60, coming in the form of impact, 48 as slash and 12 as puncture, which places it firmly in the top end of the table in terms of damage. It also boasts a fantastic 35% status chance and a fairly average 15% critical chance and 200% critical damage multiplier. It also comes with a very high degree of accuracy, to such an extent that heavy caliber makes almost no difference whatsoever, and in addition to that, a very low zoom when aiming down the sight, which means that accuracy can be applied over close to medium range. There are a couple of issues with this weapon, however. Firstly comes with that magazine size. It only comes with a 6-round magazine, and when coupled with a not so quick reload at 2.1 seconds, it can feel that this weapon is fairly clunky to use, and then you actually spend half of the mission reloading. Also, that advantage of having the low zoom for those close to medium range enemies means that at longer ranges it's much more difficult to accurately hit enemies. The main problem with this weapon though, sadly, is one of its main features, that critical chance. With it only being 15%, it really makes the weapon barely effective, and only really recovers to being anywhere even vaguely effective when you take into account the Deadly Sequence Syndicate mod. So talking about that Deadly Sequence mod, it can be acquired from the parent sequence for a total of 25,000 standing and requires the rank of Senior Executive. Now what the mod does is that it boosts the critical damage of the Grinlok by 200%, while also adding the secret syndicate effect to the weapon. And when that syndicate effect procs, it releases a radial blast of 1000 radiation damage with an extremely high proc rate, causing enemies not killed by the blast to turn on each other. In addition to this, it restores 25% of the Warframe's max shields, and also increases the maximum base shields by 50%. The mod itself is amazing against any faction, especially since that radiation proc, while not necessarily killing units, the panic caused by that radiation effect is amazing, and it's almost like having a mini chaos go off every time the sequence effect procs. Now, to be able to build this weapon, you will need to be a member of a clan, with the correct research completed. And while it's not the most expensive weapon ever, requiring 2 detonite, 5,000 polymer bundle, 5,000 ferrite and a former, it's also not particularly cheap, and might take a newer player a little while to be able to farm up the materials to be able to put this thing into build. Which, bearing in mind it comes with a mastery rank requirement of 5, it's not a huge issue, but it's just something to bear in mind. Okay, so let's move on to modding and formering the Grinlok. Now it does come with a V as standard, however we're going to add another 5 former to the weapon, in which we're going to add 4 Vs and a dash. Now the majority of the mods are going to remain the same between all 3 of our builds. We've got Serration for damage, Split Chamber for multi-shot, we've got Heavy Caliber, which is going to increase our damage at the reduction of that accuracy. And as I said before, the weapon is so accurate that you're barely going to notice the Heavy Caliber on there. Then we got our crit mods, Point Strike for crit chance, Vital Sense for crit damage, and then we got Deadly Sequence, the Syndicate mod, which is going to further increase that crit chance, as well as adding the sequence effect to the weapon. Now for our Grineer build, since we're going to be focusing really on the heavy units, we're going to go with Radiation, and Hellfire, and Stormbringer. For Corpus, we're going to go with Stormbringer and Cryo rounds to bring up magnetic damage to really deal with those shielded Corpus units. And then in the Void, we're going to go Infected, Clip and Stormbringer, unless you're running the Corrosive Projection build, in which you'll change out Stormbringer for Cryo rounds, and that will bring up viral damage instead of the corrosive damage that you will be doing without that Corrosive Projection build. So on to my recommendation as to whether I feel the Grinlok is worth the time, effort and resources invested into maxing it. And honestly, it's very difficult to recommend it when compared to other weapons that do a very similar role. The problem is that there are other weapons that does what the Grinlok does, but just quite frankly just does it better. If you're looking for an accurate crit-based rifle, then the Sybaris outperforms the Grinlok in pretty much every capacity. But the main problem comes when you compare it to another group of semi-auto, high-accuracy, high-crit weapons, the sniper rifles. The Grinlok has more in common with a lot of the snipers than something like the Sybaris. But then it doesn't really do that very well either. If you're looking for a weapon with decent crit, decent damage and a magazine, then something like the Volkar outperforms the Grinlok consistently. And if you're not fussed about the magazine, even the Vectis outperforms it as well. The Grinlok is very distinctly average stats wise, which makes it so difficult to recommend. And the fact that you need to use 2 crit chance mods, which includes that syndicate mod only to get a critical chance that matches a weapon like the Latron Prime, feels inefficient and sadly takes up too much room on the weapon. The critique I've always had of crit weapons in the past is that when you take into account the crit mods, the damage mods, multi-shot, etc., you're only going to end up with 3 mod slots. With the Grinlok you end up with 2 because that deadly sequence is badly needed to make this weapon even viable for a crit build, limiting you to only ever 2 elemental mods, and meaning that you can't use mods like Shred in conjunction with the heavy caliber to try and mitigate that very low magazine size. Of course you could ignore the syndicate mod entirely, build the weapon for straight up elemental damage, and put a single crit chance mod on the Grinlok to take advantage of that average crit chance, and the weapon would perform fairly well, but it's still tough to recommend over a dedicated crit weapon like the Sybaris or the Volkar. Now the reasoning behind my build is purely down to that magazine size. The Grinlok only with that magazine size of 6 really means it's seriously not there for spreading status procs around. Yes, you can get great status on the weapon at the expense of that raw damage. So with the fact that it only has a 67.5 chance to crit, the weapon suffers a lot of the problems that the snipers have, such as if it doesn't crit, it doesn't kill. So maxing out that damage potential from those elemental mods I feel really is necessary. Shred of course is an option for lower level missions and makes the low magazine size really work for it, with the ability to kill multiple enemies in a row, mitigating that small magazine size to an extent. However, after saying all of that, the Grinlok is a fun weapon to use at the lower levels. I've actually had a lot of fun playing with this weapon. It's not like the weapon is utter garbage and not good for anything, and it is going to deal with things like your Tower 4 Exterminate, but it is going to drop off quickly in the endless missions. It's just, with all those difficulties, I find it very hard to recommend maxing this over something that does the same job just much better. After all of the former and all the time and effort, the Grinlok just feels disappointing when compared to similar weapons with similar former. So in essence, the Grinlok is a really fun weapon, and believe me, it is fun, and it's not terrible, it's just very difficult to recommend, since right now it's outclassed by everything that's similar to it. As always guys, many thanks for watching. Please remember to leave a like and subscribe, it helps me out a ton, and I shall see you in the next episode.